Arthur Dent, filling in for Judy Fenari here on the Chronic Rift. Before we begin, we would like to welcome our new sponsor, the Science Fiction Chronicle, a monthly news magazine of the latest in science fiction and fantasy. Thank you, guys. What is it about horror that terrifies you? Is it that meatloaf that you've been meaning to put in the refrigerator for a week but quite haven't? Is it the things that go bump in the night? Is it the head going rolling down the hall? What is horror? We'll talk about that later on. If there is a later on. Ooh, I'm scared. All right, the most important thing in television this week is this week's Community Watch. We found out on the Next Generation episode, Family, that Chief O'Brien's full name is Miles Edward O'Brien. Not bad. I like it. Works for me. We're still looking for you, Combe. Write in, call us, do something. In other news and television, we on the Chronic Rift watched both episodes of the season premiere of Quantum Leap. By far, this is one of the best shows on television today. We're still torn. We don't know whether we like Sam with his family in '69 or Sam with his brother in Vietnam better. I don't know. It's the best writing and the best show anywhere. You can see this show on NBC, 8 o'clock on Fridays. We'd like to continue our list of the nominations for the Chronic Rift Awards. Remember, you've only got until January 31st to write in. And don't be scared, don't be shy. Send us that self-addressed stamped envelope for the list. Well, here goes the next part of the list. Best TV episode, best movie, best novel, best comic book. That's all I'm giving you tonight. This week's book note is a book currently in release by Baen Books. The Interior Life, A Quest by Catherine Blackman is actually two stories running on at the same time. It involves a modern-day housewife named Sue, who has a mental link with the world of Demura. There, the Lady Amarella, her servant Marianella, and other assorted nobles must do battle against the forces of darkness. The modern story, a charming domestic tale, is far more engrossing than the stock fantasy, which has no twists to the typical standard battle against evil. Interior Life sells for $3.95 in paperback. There are plans brewing, bubble, toil and trouble, to bring the hit London musical Return to the Forbidden Planet to Broadway. The musical, the sequel to that classic film, is currently running in England and has won the Olivier Award for Best Musical. This week's memorable moment. Ah, yes, it comes from the woman who's responsible for Keith, Grace Ann DeCandido. She writes in and tells me, Dear Judy, I and some fellow intelligent, capable, no-nonsense women have discovered something we all have in common, besides being intelligent, capable, no-nonsense women. We're all gushy romantics at heart, and we all love Ladyhawke. This beautiful fantasy movie is one of my all-time favorites, and this scene in particular is lovely, combining as it does extraordinary special effects, unconsummated longing, and an intense cinematic push toward resolving the curse that keeps the lovers so terribly separate. Romantically, Grace Ann DeCandido. And remember, write in and tell us your memorable moment.
She tends to get kind of emotional.
Ah!
Anyway, I'm Ford Prefect, in for Keith DeCandido, critic for the Comics Journal. This is Comic Art Commentary. The biggest difficulty with preserving comics as an art form is just that, preserving it. Most comics are printed on highly acidic newsprint and deteriorates very rapidly. Old comics, no matter how well taken care of, are usually pretty yellow at this point. It makes archival preservation very difficult. Enter Microcolor International, a New Jersey-based micro-reproduction firm which has been licensed by DC Comics to make high-quality color microfiche of assorted Golden Age funny books. Golden Age Comics Volume 1 features the first 10 issues of Action Comics, All-Star Comics, Batman, Superman, as well as the 26th through 40th issues of Detective Comics, which were the first 15 to feature the Batman. This is fiche, for the uninitiated. It is a teeny little sheet, 105 millimeters by 148 millimeters, that's roughly 4 by 6. It's a sheet of tiny images that can be read on a microfiche reader. There are undoubtedly ones at your local public library. You can also order one from Microcolor International when you order the Golden Age microfiche. Golden Age Comics is on Cyberchrome, which lasts far longer than ordinary microfiche, and each sheet will contain a full issue. Ads, letters pages, covers, the whole spiel. The books are very tough to track down. No one source has all these old comics, and some people weren't willing to part with them because they're very valuable. However, they managed it, and it is now available from Microcolor International, 85 Godwin Avenue, Midland Park, New Jersey, 07432. Or you can call them at 1-800-666-4054. Binders containing 50 to 60 issues worth of fiche are $39.95. Set of 5 is $29.95, which is expensive, but a whole hell of a lot cheaper than the originals, which number in the thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. You can also buy a 12-pound 11 by 11 fiche reader, which is available for $210. That includes shipping, handling, insurance, and all that other neat stuff. This week's comic in review is Nation of Snitches by Jon Hammer. DC Comics was one of the last companies to provide at least an option for creator-owned material. Even Marvel Comics, which has never exactly been a champion of creators' rights, has had the mostly creator-owned Epic line for some years now. Last year, DC started Piranha Press, which has been a sort of a hit-and-miss affair of creator-owned material. Still, editor Mark Nevelo has provided an outlet for such personal and offbeat talents as Kyle Baker, William Messner-Loebs, Douglas Michael, and Nadine Messner-Loebs. Nation of Snitches is one of 2 by Hammer. The other is called The Drowned Girl. Hammer is an artist that Nevelo admired and asked him to do a couple of comic books. It's very obvious that Hammer is new at this. He tries to cram too much into this story. The title comes from a TV show he uses in the book, which is similar to shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. People help turn in suspected criminals. He also lampoons sensationalist TV, stereotypes of city cops, the current flap about heavy metal and rap music, yuppies, and anything else he can fit in. Nation of Snitches itself is a focal point for a series of murders supposedly committed by Satanists, but are in fact by a janitor, posing as an exterminator. The problem with this is that it's all lampooning. There's no real satire here, no bite to it. The only thing that really works is a show called Healthier Than Thou, a sort of hybrid of Richard Simmons and Morton Downey Jr. The book does have its funny moments, but as satire, it's a failure. Good social commentary should have some kind of viewpoint, a stance. The stance shouldn't be obvious necessarily, indeed the more obscure it is, the better. But Hammer doesn't appear to have any viewpoint. He just sort of skims the surface without the rock ever actually getting wet. However, there's a lot of potential there. This is a talent that's definitely worth watching out for. I can't bring myself to recommend Nation of Snitches itself, but I urge people to keep an eye on this talent. Nation of Snitches is a graphic novel published by Piranha Press, 46 pages, $4.95, available at comic shops, and is recommended for mature readers. That's it for Comic Art Commentary this week. Next week, I'll be back to my old self. Whether that's good or not, you can judge. And I will have some nifty news for innovation, which will make science fiction and vampire fans very happy. Ah!
Mature audiences, why do they let you read it?
Well, I don't know. They let me, they sent me the thing, and I read it, and nobody stopped me.
Yeah,
No people in white coats came to take me away, so...
Did you get written approval from your parents?
No.
I'm telling.
Fine. Then again, you may not see me next week. The definition of a horror film has changed over the years. Horror used to be an Alfred Hitchcock film, or something like The Fly or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a movie that chilled you. It It was an intellectual fright. The more you thought about it, the more scared you were. The success of slasher films like 1980's Friday the 13th spawned a new generation of horror movies, where the fright was visceral. Today's horror audience is frightened by the visual repulsiveness of a head being lopped off, rather than by the thought of an alien taking over your body. This change has also altered the terminology. Movies that were called horror until around 1980 are now called thriller movies. What we will be discussing on this, our special Halloween week episode, in case you hadn't guessed the slant by now, are various aspects of this evolution. Is the genre better or worse for this shift in focus? Is there a place for Hitchcockian thrillers in today's modern cinema? Has this change been reflected in the horror literature as well? With Judy and I to discuss these death-defying questions are Dennis McCarthy, an artist who appeared on the Riff's discussion of cover art a number of weeks back. Way over on the other side there is Mark Annichiarico, a book review editor for Library Journal who also reviews horror books for that magazine, and Bob Martin, former editor of Fangoria Magazine, now a screenwriter, with such movies as Frankenhooker and the upcoming Basket Case 3 to his credit. Bob, now you started Fangoria in 1979.
I was an editor at Fangoria with issue 1. I took it over with issue 2, and I more or less shaped the magazine, because if you look at issue 1, you'll find it's a fantasy film magazine. It became a horror film magazine under my purview.
Okay, now you started the magazine right at about the same time this trend started.
Well, yeah, there was Halloween had just come out. Texas Chainsaw Massacre had come out a couple years before, but there was no Friday the 13th yet, no Freddy Krueger, no sequels to Halloween. Phantasm came out right after we started. The Brood, David Cronenberg's film, and The Shining, which I think is a movie that had a lot to do with the repopularization of horror in the 80s.
Do you think that the changes that I mentioned are for the better or for the worse for the genre?
Well, I would argue with some of the changes that you say exist.
Okay.
At the time Hitchcock was working, at the time, let's say Psycho came out, or before that when he was doing Saboteur, people wouldn't think of that as a horror movie, they would think of Frankenstein. They would think of the Universal stuff, which was also looked upon as trash compared to Hitchcock. Now horror is still looked upon as trash compared to, let's say, Someone to Watch Over Me, which is a classy thriller. But I think that gore is certainly a new thing that that's been allowed because of the rating system. Just like you didn't have graphic sex films made by Hollywood before there was a rating system. You didn't have graphic bloody films made before there was a rating system. And the rating system itself, by creating this R rating that therefore protects children, allowed these changes to happen. And even though the rating system gets criticized a lot, I think that's a good thing, because I think people should be free to express themselves.
Mark, do you think there's been a similar change in the literature as the change in the movies has gone on? Do you think that there's been a parallel change in the horror books?
Not really, I don't think so. The genre that you're describing was first started with the DC, not DC, EC comics, yeah, with the pulp horror stories. And they're still popular right now, and you know, they didn't have the same artistic restraint that a visual media had on them. You know, there wasn't as much, I think sex today is much more intertwined with a lot of horror that's written, but as far as, you know, the very descriptive, gory passages, that's nothing new.
No? You think that's something that's sort of the films had to catch up with in a way?
Yeah, they didn't. The mediums are too different. Something like a film would have come under too much of a heavy criticism at the time.
We talked about special effects last week on the show, and I think that might have something to do with it also.
Certainly does.
The way special effects have advanced. I mean, you couldn't do a decapitated head in the 50s.
You could do it, but it might not
Yeah.
look as good. Certainly, but then again, there's things like what was it? Oh, well, since I left Fangoria, I've blotted out a lot of things that I should remember. But Feed Without a Face had some pretty neat monsters. Monsters were interesting in the 50s. Of course, you have people like Paul Blaisdell, whose work often looked pretty paper mache-like. He was working on no budget for Roger Corman. Nowadays, everything is big budget. Independent film is hurting. You don't see the little guys making little, low-budget movies as much because the majors have a lock on it. The majors are allowed to own theaters again, which was, and the antitrust laws kept them from owning theaters, but Mr. Reagan sort of put aside the antitrust laws, so the majors own theaters again. During the summer, you cannot get a booking because theaters, the majors release 3,000 prints of a movie. How does a little film get bookings? So what you have is state-of-the-art effects only. You don't get those junky monsters you used to get. People who like trash film have to look at the video shelves for that movie that never got into theaters and take it home and check it out. And 9 out of 10 times, it's not worth seeing.
Like Attack of the 50-Foot Woman.
But if you love horror, you'll put up with Drek. That's Stephen King said that a long time ago. Any horror fan is someone who is willing to put up with 90% of the stuff that is absolute time wasting. And people who are not into horror see this from outside and they think it's 100%. They're not aware of the 10% that you find by mining for what you like.
Because they're not willing to filter.
Exactly.
It's worth it to, you know, if you are a horror fan, to watch everything just because of the occasional little gem that you overturn. And that makes everything worth
And
it.
since that stuff doesn't stand out on its own, if you're looking at a rack of things, there's no way to tell.
And it applies to gore films as well, because if you look at, if you just check out 3 or 4 gore films, you're going to see 3 or 4 lousy movies. But if you, at Fangoria, I was into Japanese samurai films more than I was into gory horror films before I became editor of Fangoria. I had never seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes. I had seen Halloween. And I did like Japanese samurai films, so I did have a certain appreciation of violence.
Shogun Assassin.
And I became a fan of this type of film as editor of Fangoria because it was my job to see them. And I realized that just like everything else, there's a certain percentage that is done with art, and then there's a vast percentage that's ham-handed and done for money.
Yeah.
I've got a question.
You've got a question?
Oh, my God.
Oh, please, go ahead.
This is from a person who doesn't like horror, like, not into it.
Which type?
The Stephen King type specifically, and that's my question. His books have a certain mystique about them, and a lot of people like them and read them. But then you go to his movies. I've been dragged kicking and screaming to his movies. I watch them like this.
And they're all horrible.
And it's just a gore fest.
Have you which of his books have you read, if any?
I read The Shining, and Silver Bullet. I taught that. And I taught Silver Bullet,
it's a simple book.
The kids were screaming, "We want to see it!" I'm like, "Oh no, please!"
The movie was absolutely terrible. Yes.
I mean,
he's the first to admit it too. He's, you know, he doesn't apologize for it.
He's had bad luck with adaptations to film. He's had very bad luck.
If the effects were just a little.
Dead Zone was good. Pet Sematary was okay. A lot of people like it more than I did. I didn't care for Pet Cemetery either.
Well, I like the original ending much better.
What was the original ending?
In the original ending, the guy, in Pet Sematary, his wife comes home and is going to kill him, and she's undead. In the book, she comes home to stay with him, and she's dead.
Oh.
Which has to do with like deterioration on on the part of his mind as well as.
It's much happier ending.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way.
Depends on how you look at it.
Sort of like the ending of Frankenhooker. No, nobody here has seen it.
Oh. Okay.
I saw it in the video tape rental place.
Yeah, it'll be out. It'll be out in another couple months.
Wonderful.
Goodness.
But don't wait. Go to the Waverly Theater. I would say.
I mentioned before Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Fly. There was a trend in the 50s. The sort of similar. It went along with the Red Scare. And the fact that the invasion of the Body Snatchers was in many ways an allegory to communist takeover of America, fears of that.
Well, the rest of that there was that theme, and everything else was blended in, like fear of atomic things. And if you notice during the 50s, there were very few movies about people being horrible. There were just things that were bad, and that had a lot to do with World War II.
What do you mean?
The problem of
just
evil.
faced
The problem of
right.
evil.
Mm. How do you define evil after you've just, I mean, how can you do evil in a movie or a book when you've just faced an actual human being?
It
flesh
doesn't,
and blood?
yeah,
Or-
it's not the...
Or after the Holocaust.
Right, exactly. You know, facing Hitler. That's an interesting point.
All the actors were white, upper middle class, usually students, who couldn't get their parents to believe them, like in The Blob.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was,
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Yeah, it was always something like that. It was something
the teenagers are a disenfranchised class, and that's why, I mean, it's a popular conception, at least among people who finance films, that their audience is comprised of black people and teenagers. Disenfranchised people.
People who need
A horror
fantasies more
movie's
than
message is always something is wrong. If it's a horror movie, it ain't a feel-good movie.
No. You don't call something horror.
And the purpose of horror can be to scare, but it can also be to disturb, and to give the audience sort of a confirmation that, yeah, you're right, the world is not exactly the way it's supposed to be. I think that's one reason why teenagers like it.
I think that's one of the differences between, like, a Stephen King novel, especially one of the later Stephen King novels after he became famous and didn't have to try hard.
Ooh, nasty.
And forget about having him on this show.
But something like that, which is, as I said before, a visceral thrill. It's supposed to be something where you're watching, you know, decapitated heads, arms getting cut off, big ugly people with long fingernails.
My students love it.
Right, but I
Love
think
it
the
to
difference
death.
between that and something, there's a story by James Tiptree Jr. called, what the hell is the name of it? Oh, damn, I forgot the name. The story is about how men decide, mostly religious men, and it's a science fiction story, so in this future world they have more power, decide that women aren't necessary.
Excuse me?
They don't have souls, they're not necessary to existence.
Sounds like The Handmaid's Tale.
This is a feel-good
Similar.
story. It's a
Well,
feel-good
yeah,
story.
But I mean, exactly. That
For
was,
upper
It was
class
written by a
religious
woman.
men.
I
It
mean,
was.
James
James Tiptree Jr. is really
is a
Alice
woman.
Sheldon.
and,
But that story was scary. You put that down and it's like, ugh! And I think that's a much more legitimate bit of horror.
Having your
than-
reality ripped out from under you,
Yeah. I mean,
as opposed to just having something introduced into your reality.
literally ripped out.
Well,
from
in the way some of the main characters in a lot of slasher movies are set up, they're living in nice, quiet little suburban neighborhoods, and everything's normal. They don't even lock the doors.
Amityville Horror.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden something interrupts their lives that is totally against the whole set of their pattern. That's just wrong, and what the knife-wielding maniac looks like is nothing compared to the idea that there could be something that's going to make tomorrow unpleasant and make it unpredictable.
Or non-existent.
Right.
The best thing to scare people with is something that they fear themselves, that they half expect to happen. Frankenhooker, not to plug my movie again, but Frankenhooker itself is about a guy who decides to remake his girlfriend.
Right.
And as such, it has something to say about the way men are in relationship to women, and the way women are in relationship to men, and it does disturb people. It received an X with no graphic sex, no graphic violence. 9 women blow up, but there's no blood. It is a bloodless blow up, totally fantasy. When you see it, it looks totally fake, and that's deliberately so. The reviewers who understood it gave us very good reviews. The reviewers who disliked it said that the effects all looked cheap.
And, that was the
And they
idea.
didn't realize, they didn't have a clue as to what we were saying.
You did the novelization of a movie called Brain Damage.
Brain Damage, which
Right.
was
What was that?
also by
that?
Frank
While we're on
Hanna.
the subject of your movies.
Well, after I left Fangoria, I was feeling quite rejected because actually I was fired by the company that put out Fangoria. And I also, Fangoria being what it was and the fan press being what it is, I always felt that I was kind of abused by the fan press and never recognized. And Fangoria is a significant magazine in the field. It's never won any fan awards or anything. I mean, nobody's going to pat Fangoria on the back. It's not a nice, cuddly little magazine. So I was feeling really rejected, and Frank Henenlotter's regular producing partner called me up and said that Frank had his second film finally going after 9 years of trying to get a decent budget. So he wanted me to read the script. I read the script. It had everything I ever wanted to write about in it, and drugs, sex, violence. And
The essentials of modern life.
The essentials of modern life.
No rock and roll.
And yeah, well, there is a rock and roll scene in it, but the swimming pool cues did the song in the movie, and I hate that band.
Oh, well.
So, at any rate, Frank wanted there to be a book. That's all. He just wanted something to put on his shelf. So he made a deal with me where I would receive the rights to the first certain number of copies I printed. After that, we'd share a royalty. So I published it myself and did quite well with the limited edition that I initially put out. That's all gone now. I've got the paperback edition. And it's doing okay. It's doing okay. People kind of forgotten Brain Damage. The movie got kind of lost in its release. It got very well reviewed, but the distributor just didn't know what he was doing.
It's brain damaged.
Distributor, yes, was definitely.
And also it was cut kind of unfortunately in order to get an R rating. Frankenhooker remains X and remains strong. If we cut it for the R, it would be a mess. It would be a mess. They wanted to cut us. The demands for cuts were very strange. For instance, there was one shot in a bathroom where people are smoking crack, and we show this very raggedy-looking individual sucking on a pipe for all his life.
I'm sorry to stop you, but the witching hour is upon us.
Oh, dear.
Yes. Cute, 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 cute. Thank you, guys. Thank you very... No, I'm trying to be dramatic. Thank you very much for joining us here. I'm Alistair Cook. Good night. Next week, alternative comic books. And don't go anywhere
without your towel.
This episode was sponsored in part by the Science Fiction Chronicle, the monthly science fiction and fantasy news magazine at area specialty shops. For subscription information, write to them at Box 2730, Brooklyn, New York, 11202 0056.